let me congratulate you all on your selection for this trip. It will be remarkable. You're going there at a remarkable time, which I say with some perspective. Since Steve didn't ask me what my favorite place is, I'll volunteer that my favorite place, for perverse reasons, is Bucharest, Romania, where many years ago I was writing my dissertation and living in Romania under communism with my long-suffering wife. And that produces inevitably the following conversation when things are going, shall we say, a little rocky, as they sometimes do between couples. I will lean over to her and in my best Bogart say, "But we'll always have Bucharest." And she looks at me and says, "That's what I'm afraid of." So we gave up that part of the world, and I became center director to learn about this part of the world at a time when it was not quite as exciting as it is now. And you are going at an extremely exciting and somewhat daunting time. So let me thank Kathy and Steve for inviting me to offer this presentation. And when one thinks about the EU in terms of its crises, what I have titled this presentation is Europe's Crises, What They Are and Why They Matter. I call them existential crises for reasons which I will make clear. These are not just difficult times, although they are. But in my view, these challenge the very essence of what the EU is and what it means to be European, of which they are, of course, the emblematic identity. A couple of definitions. When I say Europe, what I really mean is the EU. But of course, we know that Europe includes non-EU countries. But for purposes of this talk and your visit, it's really the EU which is the focus. And when I say crisis, I'm lying, because there's really more than one. The approach I offer is the following. This is Peyton Manning. And before the last Super Bowl, people recognized that he was an extraordinary athlete with a great career, unique achievements against all odds. Many detractors, he nevertheless accomplished a great deal, but people said, did he have one more in him? Was he still the great athlete? I use this as a metaphor for the EU, because we can say the EU has extraordinary achievements, and we wonder if it can do it again in the face of challenges, doubters, and detractors. The EU can point to a remarkable success record, growing from 6 members to 28 now, transforming, at the time, 10 former communist dictatorships into capitalist democracies. Let's not forget, and all of you who teach history will know this, of course, that it took a zone which had seen millions of deaths in 2 terrible wars in the last 100 years and turned it into a zone not only of peace, where war is unthinkable, but also one of democracy and prosperity. The EU is the world's largest economy, taken as a single actor. It is also the largest market for US goods. It is the largest receiver and sender of direct foreign investment. To give you some perspective, US assets in Ireland are 4 times US assets in China. US assets in the Netherlands are 14 times the assets in China. Sometimes we get sort of China blind and forget the long-standing and substantial ties. 1/3 of all global trade is accounted for by trade between the US and Europe, 50% of the world's GDP, and 40% of the world's purchasing power. Here in the Pittsburgh region, of the 10 largest foreign firms operating, 7 of them are from Europe. In other words, it matters. What happens in Europe matters. Now, however, we can reasonably ask, with some fear and trepidation, whether or not the organization will even see the 60th anniversary of the landmark Treaty of Rome 1957, in which it was founded almost in its current form. Why do I say that? I say that because I see, and I'm going to come back to this, I see the crises facing it, and I'm going to indicate what those are, as existential not simply difficult times that they have to deal with for 4 reasons, which I'll also come back to. Because of the scale, because they're all happening at once, because they're happening in a new environment, which I'll explain what I mean by that, and because they go to the heart of both the European project and the European identity. So what are the crises? You who teach English, Cindy, you'll recognize this reference, 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. What are Europe's 4 crises as I see them? They are, of course, the refugee and migrant crises, the popular challenge, national challenge, which I distinguished from those, and an astounding, pernicious economic lethargy. Now, as a footnote, notice I consider these the 4 existential crises, and I didn't even mention things like terrorism, or the Russian threat, or relations with the US. Those are problematic enough. But in my view, these are the 4 fundamental crises. And let me spend a minute talking about each one. In the year 2010, and I hope you can all see this slide, it is the most up-to-date because it includes all of last year. In 2010, fewer than 20,000 refugees came to Europe across the Mediterranean. Last year, that number exceeded 1 million. You can see the huge jump there. 850,000 of whom came through Greece, a country about the size of Alabama, whose gross domestic product had already shrunk 25% in the last 7 years. This past January, more than 1,600 people a day were arriving in Greece. Now just imagine that number arriving in New York City or in Boston or in Pittsburgh. That would be challenge enough. But arriving in Greece, it has overwhelmed capacities. As an example, Slovenia, one of the more prosperous former Balkan members of the EU, in October saw a number of refugees that was 12 times the number of its entire police force and military combined. So even if there were goodwill, and there is a substantial amount of that, the ratio of demand to capacity is outsized. These are the routes, the most common routes, and I'll come back to this as well because these are, to some extent, these are changing, from across the Mediterranean, mostly from North Africa, then from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan through Turkey and into Greece, what's known as the Western Balkan route. For purposes of statistics and keeping track, and this issue will almost certainly come up on your trip. This is where the first-time applicants for asylum, and they're presumed to be asylum, come from. And as you can see, they are mostly from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Where do they want to go? This chart shows they want to go to Sweden and Germany. Now, in many respects, this should be a home run pitch for the EU. This requires a multinational response across nations with merged capacities, and the EU should be well placed to deal with what is clearly a challenge that one state cannot handle alone. So far, as they say in sports, the EU has come up small. They came up with a plan the end of last year to resettle 160,000, a very small portion, and of that 160,000, as of the following months, less than 300 souls had actually been resettled. It's just a pathetic response. The EU response has been to try to manage the numbers, move them around, make sure that one country doesn't get the burden. Clearly that has not succeeded. Second, they have tried to strengthen the external borders. As most of you know, there is a system of external borders, commonly referred to as Schengen, though not all of the countries are in Schengen. and make those borders tougher. But the EU has also had to look the other way, or faute de mieux, allow reinstitution of internal borders. Hungary, Austria, between Sweden and Denmark, two of the most prosperous countries, and of course in Germany itself. A third EU response is what I call hectoring. I hope everyone gets the classical reference. Hectoring Greece, get it? In other words, trying to yell at the Greeks and say, why aren't you doing more? There's a little bit of irony in that. Shaming them into doing more, but not only them, trying to shame the Hungarians and the Slovaks who say, we don't want any refugees. This is also a topic I'm going to come back to, turning to others. Making a deal with Turkey, I'm sure most of you who are paying attention, this will certainly be a hot topic because it's still in the formulation stage of making a deal for Turkey to stop some of those, or all of those, we're trying to get from Turkey to Greece, in return for allowing a regular process. The other side of that coin is that the Greeks now have the obligation to send them back, which has its, and there are a range of issues involved here, and of course Turkey is not an EU member. So the EU has to turn to, but Turkey has by itself housed almost 3 million refugees, most from Syria, for the last several years, and nobody made a fuss about it, and nobody else paid for it. So the Turks are in a very high leverage position. I loved one column by Philip Stevens who wrote about, he called this slouching towards Ankara. If you remember your Yeats and Ozymandias, this image of the EU having to get bailed out towards Turkey. A fifth response, which is pretty much a minor chord because it's not likely to have much short-term consequence, is going to what I call the generators. That is, you try to settle the Syrian civil war, no problem there, they'll take care of it in a weekend. Reestablish stable democracies in Libya or in Iraq, or even further afield in Afghanistan. That's a long-term solution, but everybody agrees until that something is done, the flow will still be stimulated by the generators. All of this has contributed to the second of the crises, populist nationalist challenges. And the images I've used here are from the UK, which we'll come back to. Of course, Marine Le Pen in France and her Front National. And on the bottom right is this group Pegida, which you've probably heard about. Not a political party, but a deeply anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim, and as you can see by that poster, anti-Merkel group. And I included this image on the left, which is from Poland, which after all is hardly the front lines. Nevertheless, this nationalist challenge has been spurred there. That sign says, today immigrants, tomorrow terrorists. And Poland has, of course, recently elected a fairly right-wing, Euroskeptical government. We are seeing this throughout Europe. This is a remarkable breakdown of the last European Parliament elections, and I do hope you get to visit the European Parliament, because it is a fascinating institution, which, by the way, has to approve the EU-Turkey deal, among other things. And in that last election, these parties came in first. These are far right, which is to say they're not simply conservative parties. They're to the right of European conservative parties, and they came in first in the UK, first in Denmark, first in France. The Freedom Party in Austria. Jobbik in Hungary is to the right of Fidesz, the governing party. It's unbelievable and frightening. Right-wing populism has taken a substantial hold of popular attitudes throughout Europe. Recently in Austria, which you can see has a high level, the Freedom Party, this far-right, anti-immigrant, anti-EU party, came in second in regional elections, and their candidate won the first round of presidential elections. A man named Norbert Hofer. He may or may not win the next time, but it's troubling, and we all know about Marine Le Pen. Now, they have used the refugee issue to boost their standing And it's not just, as you could see, not just at home, but in EU institutions. But it's based on long-standing Eurosceptic views that are based on nativism, views that are hostile to the whole European project. They're nativist, they're racist, but the EU issue has it in a way galvanized. But it's broader than that, as you can see from this quote from Marine Le Pen, who's leading all the polls in the French upcoming political election. She says, the people have spoken loud and clear. They no longer want to be led by those outside our borders, by EU commissioners and technocrats who are unelected. They want to be protected from globalization and take back the reins of their destiny. Does that rhetoric have any familiar ring to it? You can see that it has a certain appeal. Attitudes in Europe, which are troubling and underlie this, are a growing, let me say, an erosion of the positive attitude that the EU used to have. In 2005, some 50% of people had a favorable, polled in Europe in its Eurobarometer, had a favorable view of the EU. That has fallen to around 37% in the recent poll, and negative views of the EU have grown from 15 to 23%. In other words, the underlying attitudes, dissipation of trust, have supported these parties and their policies, which, let's face it, are for turning back the clock. Here's a chart of election results of right-wing parties from the Nordic countries, which I put up on purpose because they are typically viewed as the most tolerant, they are certainly the most prosperous, and you can see, and I've looked at the programs of some of these parties, the Swedish Democrats, poorly named, for example, are borderline Nazis. I mean, they are racist and anti-Islamic and very hostile to refugees and to the EU, in part because they see the EU as forcing refugees on them. This leads to my third crisis, which are national challenges, which I distinguish from what you might call internal populist ones, by saying what are the challenges from nations within the EU, and of course chief among these is from the UK, and its plan to hold a referendum on June 23rd, but you'll be in Europe, and believe me, people will be watching the results of that. Now, hostility and skepticism in Great Britain to the EU is not new. They didn't join until 73. They held a referendum in 75. And if you look at each of the political parties, this is not just a conservative issue. It's often pictured as such. Each of the political parties has promised that if they got in, they would hold a referendum. David Cameron did so in 2013. He won the elections in 2015. He's now obliged to hold the referendum that he promised. And Britain has always been, one observer called it semi-detached. It's not a member of Schengen. It's not a member of the Eurozone. It's always gone its own way. That's not enough for some people, including UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which has not only put forth the idea of an in-out vote, but pushed the Conservative Party, which has won the last few elections, to offer people a chance to vote on it. Whatever one may think of the merits of that, there's no doubt of what the implications would be if Great Britain left the UK. Great Britain is the third largest country in the EU. Did I say leave the UK? No, I meant to say leave the EU. It's the third in terms of GDP. In terms of defense spending, as a percentage of gross domestic product, it is first. In terms of military expenditure per capita and personnel, it is first and second, respectively. In terms of trade with the US, it is second. And in terms of EU proportion of its own trade, this is sort of interesting. In terms of exports, this is a range of 18 months. It's not as high as some other EU countries are, but it is a crucial economic and political actor in the EU, and virtually, probably along with France, the only one with any military capability at all. So just think about that from the stand. You're going to visit NATO, and I'm sure the subject is going to come up. You know, of course, they're not leaving NATO, but what does it mean for the EU's capacity to act as a unified actor? and to maintain the so-called special relationship with the United States. This is why the president himself intervened in the British debate and told them not to pull out. But there's a second issue as well, which is this is almost certain to lead to other countries demanding the same thing. Marine Le Pen has made it clear that France should do that, the Netherlands. I had a student who wrote a paper who looked into all of this. And he came up with, after Brexit, he said there'll be Nexit and Czechsit, because the Czechs will say, but the most significant of the new members will be Poland, who without doubt will say, okay, we want our terms. And then you have a very different EU. And that, I think that's just, it would be an extraordinary development. It's ironic, too, that for those of you that teach Western Europe, that people were waiting for the challenge to come since the end of the Cold War. They assumed the challenge would come from Germany. Reunited Germany, economic colossus, political powerhouse, history, everybody expected that. In fact, it's been the opposite. Angela Merkel has been praised as the savior of Europe, and the challenge has instead come from the UK. The second of the national challenges is what I call the democratic drift. Here you have in two of my boys. I used to study East Europe. That was where I spent my time. And so I'm embarrassed that my kindergartners have grown up to be delinquent high schoolers now. Poland and Hungary, in both cases you have conservative, I mean that socially and politically, Euroskeptic regimes, but even more significantly, they are both setting about to dismantle the structures of democracy in their own countries, weaken the press, remove the independence of the judiciary and the central bank, redo the constitution. Now, they're not the first countries to do it, but if they do it inside the EU as an EU member, and the EU can't do anything about it, that goes to the heart of what the EU is supposed to be about. They don't have a strong military, they can't force people, but they have this enormous, or have had, what people refer to as soft power, normative power. Well, if they don't have that, then I despair, really, if they can't get these countries to behave in a way they promised to behave, and in a way which they had to do in order to get admitted in the first place. Which leads to the fourth of the crises, the economic lethargy. And I love this chart because it puts two important things in perspective. This illustrates the lethargy is the term I use because this is what it fits. The 100 on the extreme left is just before the crisis of 2008. That's where their economies were. And so what you see in these charts is how long it has taken them to get back to the pre-2008 levels. You see right away, of course, I suppose there's a pointer on here, right? Oops! I did something wrong. There you go. Never mind the pointer. You see that the US, in about 3 years, just under 4 years, managed to get itself going. And some of the EU members did, but some, as you can see from the purple line down below, are not even close. So this is now 7 years past the crisis, and they're still trying to recover. So that points to two things. A lack of economic energy, entrepreneurship, viability on the one hand, but also a division, a kind of north-south division within the EU of inequality. Now, if you think about the EU, what it was supposed to do from the beginning, this is counter to their whole narrative. They're all supposed to prosper. They have prospered for a while. They're all supposed to be in it together. And not only are a substantial number sluggish, but the rich ones can't seem to figure out a way to help them. If you look at this chart, here's growth projections. This is a comparative chart, including the whole world. And here's where the euro area comes in. So growth has been anemic. You can imagine what it would be like in this country. It's difficult enough with the out party challenging the incumbent when you have growth in the 2.5%. If we were struggling along like that, it's skewed, of course, because some are doing better. But the EU as a whole, as an institution, as a body, cannot point to this result and say, see how great we're doing, see how it helps us to be a member, I'm afraid that the evidence doesn't support it. And in real terms, when you look at employment, you have employment growth that is absolutely anemic, less than 0.4%, and unemployment, which of course is stubbornly at the 9.5 or 10, and that's aggregated. It's much higher in the southern part of Europe, and it's much higher among young people. This chart shows that, of course, the figures for unemployment are even worse if you exclude Germany, which is, of course, the major succeeding actor. So I guess if you put all of these together, they constitute what I call the existential challenge. And I would remind you again, I haven't even touched on terrorism or Russia or climate change, or pervasive spread of American movies. These are real crises in Europe. But so why do I say these are existential? First of all, the scale of these. You saw that with the refugees. In relation to the capacity, it shouldn't be beyond the capacity, but it is beyond the capacity. In addition, of course, it's gone on now for several years, especially the economic one, has gone on for a long time. Second, the simultaneity. This is happening all at once. The quintessential example of this, the poster child for this, of course, is Greece, which is being hit by all of these, including the rise of a right-wing party, which is not even neo, it is Nazi. But look at this. If you look at European economic growth, for example, some of the same figures presented slightly differently for the last several years, and then you look at Greece, you can see what the EU bankers, of course, don't want to point out is, of course, the fierce austerity programs have contributed to pinching off what was even a very puny little growth and contributing to a negative. And of course, it's Greece that bears the brunt. 850,000 people coming into those islands and then to the mainland. Now, of course, it's even worse than this because Macedonia has closed its border. And so these people don't want to go to Bulgaria. They want to go up through Macedonia, through Serbia, and on the way to Germany. And they can't do it because Macedonia is closing the border. You now have this horrible spectacle of maybe 80,000 people stuck in a camp at that border. Greece is truly on the front lines. Okay, when I say my third category of why it's existential has to do with these four. It's happening in an information environment that puts enormous pressure on decision makers. They can't pretend it's not happening. There can't be anybody in this room who didn't see that pathetic picture of Aylan Kurdi, the Turkish boy who was 3 years old, who washed up on the shore. Governments can't control what people know. So they're having to take action in an information environment which is pummeling them, over which they have very little control, which is my second point. They can't control the information environment. They can't control the routes. They, as a policy actor, they are shown to have less and less control over these events. Partly because of the third category, which is the cost of transmission. It's easy and cheap for people to pass information. As you probably know, the migrants will use their cell phones to pass information around. The smugglers, people who want to take advantage of this situation. And finally, of course, they've learned at great cost that the Middle East is not very far away. They can't pretend that these conflicts are happening somewhere else. They're happening on their doorstep, on their neighborhood. And you saw the jump in Syrian refugees. And that means the environment, which is not going to go away, the environment is presenting a huge dynamic challenge to all of them, which leads, of course, to decisions like the deal with Turkey. In a way, as I say, this should be a project that the EU should be ready for, because it's beyond the capacity of even Germany to handle all by itself. Germany, for example, has so many refugees pouring in that they're putting them in soccer stadiums, in camps, and even, believe it or not, in places like Dachau, they're housing refugees. There's some irony there. And yet the EU was unable to do so. The two major pillars of the EU, of the modern EU, of the contemporary EU, which is the Eurozone and Schengen, are under direct attack and are showing themselves not terribly effective in terms of their response. So what you're getting is what political scientists call renationalization. The Austrians, the Germans, the French, they say, we'll do it ourselves. We don't want you, we don't want you to tell us what to do, we'll do it ourselves. But none of these countries can do it by themselves. They'll learn at great cost, nor can we, which we might learn at great cost. But the EU project is definitely in danger. In addition, some of the EU's moral principles are simply just routinely disregarded. In the case of the refugees, there's this thing called the Dublin Protocol, under which an asylum seeker has to claim asylum in the first place he or she lands, and then if they get rejected, they get sent back. Well, countries are just routinely ignoring that because they can't put all the pressure on Greece, even though the deal will put on the pressure at Greece. So you find the very principles of cooperation that should allow the solving, or at least the addressing of these issues, to be not functioning. I'll come back to the Turkey issue deal on Q&A if you like, but it seems to me the fundamental one has to do with the last one, which is the EU is supposed to stand for a pooled sovereignty, prosperity, democracy, moving forward, a rejection of the past, a rejection of nationalism, human values to the highest level. If instead of that, we get unequal economic deals, in which we bail out German bankers, but force the Greeks to watch their personal income drop by 25%, or if Europe builds fences, in which you have the miserable image of people desperate to get there and are not allowed to go anywhere, it goes to the heart of what is supposed to be the European system and its enormous soft power. And nobody said it better than the Pope. This is the image that the EU is facing. These are the images, and people say, is this what the EU is? Is this what people huddled on railroad stations while fences are built? Is that what the EU is supposed to be? Well, policymakers, and this will come up in Brussels, of course, too, they make decisions which are disregarded or ignored almost as soon as they're passed. And of course, you have Angela Merkel. And this is what the Pope said, which I will not read to you, because I hate it when people read slides to people whom I'm pretty sure can read. But it is really exactly what the Pope should be doing, shaming the EU, shaming Europe. My view, that is what makes it, that is one of the things that makes it an existential crisis. If you are the EU and you cannot both solve the real issues that come up and you don't stand for anything anymore, then what are you doing there? That's what you're going to find out in Brussels.